The tape started playing at 2:17 in the afternoon. A routine playback session in a Manhattan recording studio, November 1960. Ella Fitzgerald sat in the leather chair before the studio monitors, hands folded in her lap. Professional. Composed. She'd heard herself on tape thousands of times before. This should have been just another technical review. But 30 seconds in, Ella raised her hand. "Stop," she said quietly. The engineer looked confused. This was a perfect take. The orchestra had been flawless. Ella's vocal performance was everything it should be, technically perfect. Emotionally resonant. "Stop," she said again, louder. He stopped the tape. Silence filled the studio. Complete. Profound silence. Ella stood abruptly, walked toward the door. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't listen to this." Then she left. Simply walked out and disappeared into the hallway. The sound of a bathroom door closing. Then, faintly, someone crying. Because what Ella had heard in those 30 seconds wasn't what everyone else heard. And the gap between those two realities had finally become too much to bear. This is the story of a voice that everyone loved except the woman who lived inside it. About the distance between how we see ourselves and how the world sees us. About the cost of perfection and the loneliness of being excellent at something you can't fully appreciate. What does it mean to be celebrated for something you can't quite hear the way others do? To be called perfect when you know every flaw? To receive love for a gift you're not sure you fully possess? Ella Fitzgerald knew. And what she heard in her own voice that made her run reveals something profound about artistry, identity, and the impossible standards we set for ourselves. Ella Fitzgerald in 1960 was at the absolute peak of her career. 43 years old, 2 decades of recording. She'd completed her legendary songbook series. Gershwin, Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart, Irving Berlin. Each album a masterclass that would influence generations. Her voice had only improved with time. The clarity remained perfect. The 3-octave range extraordinary. But she'd added depth, emotional sophistication that came from truly knowing what songs meant. She wasn't just technically superior. She was artistically complete. But here's what nobody understood. She didn't hear what they heard. When critics called her the greatest vocalist alive, when audiences rose in standing ovations, Ella smiled and said thank you. But privately, she wondered if they were hearing someone else. If perhaps they were responding to an idea of excellence rather than reality. This wasn't false modesty. It was genuine, persistent doubt about whether her voice was actually as good as people claimed. The self-doubt had roots in her orphaned childhood. Success hadn't erased those early lessons. Because now she had evidence she was valuable, but it conflicted with the internal voice that still whispered she wasn't good enough. Every recording session followed the same pattern. She'd prepare meticulously, record perfectly within 3 or 4 takes. Then came the playback, the moment everyone else enjoyed but Ella dreaded. She'd hear everything wrong. The slight breathiness on one note, imperfect vibrato on another. Every tiny imperfection magnified until the whole performance felt compromised, inadequate, not good enough despite what everyone said. Her producers learned to anticipate this. They'd play the take, watch Ella's face tighten with self-criticism, wait for the inevitable request to do another. Not because the previous take was flawed, but because Ella's internal standards were impossible to satisfy. "That was perfect, Ella," they'd say. "We're not going to get better than that. One more," she'd insist. "I can do it better." Usually they'd humor her. Let her record another take that was essentially identical to the previous one, then use whichever version Ella decided she could tolerate. It was part of working with a perfectionist. Part of what made her great, even if it made the process more difficult. On this November 1960 day, something different happened. The song was Misty, the Errol Garner composition that had become a jazz standard. Ella recorded it with full orchestral arrangement. Strings, woodwinds, a lush backdrop. The session went smoothly. The orchestra nailed it on the second run-through. Ella's vocal take was, as always, flawless. Perfect pitch, perfect phrasing, perfect emotional delivery. Everyone knew immediately this was the take. Album ready. The engineer wound back the tape. "Want to hear it?" Standard question. Ella nodded and sat before the studio monitors. The other musicians gathered around, smiling, pleased with what they'd created. The orchestral introduction played. Beautiful. Rich. Then Ella's voice entered, that unmistakable sound. Clear as crystal, warm as summer, moving through the melody with effortless ease. "Look at me. I'm as helpless as a kitten up a tree." Perfect for Ella's interpretation. Vulnerability mixed with gentle self-awareness. The orchestration supported without overwhelming. Everything worked exactly as it should. But Ella wasn't smiling, her face had gone rigid, her hands gripped the armrests, and as the song continued, as her recorded voice sang about being helpless and hopelessly lost, something was happening that the others couldn't understand. She was hearing herself. Really hearing herself. Not analyzing for technical errors, but hearing her voice as if she were someone else encountering it for the first time. And what she heard was unbearable. She heard vulnerability she'd worked her entire life to hide, heard loneliness she'd never admitted to herself, heard the voice of someone who'd spent 43 years trying to be perfect because perfection was the only thing that felt safe. The gap between the polished performance and the raw emotion underneath was too wide to bridge. "Stop," she said quietly. The engineer, focused on sound quality, didn't hear. The song continued. "And I get misty just holding your hand." Ella's throat tightened, tears beginning to form. This was her voice singing about romantic longing, but all she could hear was deeper longing, to be good enough, to deserve the acclaim, to actually be as excellent as everyone insisted instead of the fraud she secretly feared she'd become. "Stop," she said louder, urgently. The engineer saw her face and immediately stopped the tape. Profound silence. The musicians looked at each other, confused. The take had been perfect. Why had Ella stopped it? Ella stood, her legs unsteady, vision blurring with tears she was desperately trying not to let fall. "I need a break," she managed. Her voice sounded strange. Tight. Strained. "Ella, that was beautiful," the conductor said. "Really exceptional work." She nodded, unable to speak, and walked quickly to the hallway. Made it to the bathroom. Locked the door and let the breakdown happen. She cried deep, shaking sobs from somewhere beyond sadness. From the place where years of self-doubt had been stored away, ignored for professionalism. The place where the scared orphan girl still lived, wondering why anyone believed she deserved this acclaim. Here's what Ella heard in those 30 seconds. She heard how exposed her voice sounded, how naked the emotion was, how clearly her performance revealed the person underneath the professional persona. That vulnerable woman who needed love but couldn't quite believe it when she received it was not someone Ella wanted the world to see. She'd spent decades, her entire professional life, building a carefully constructed public image. The gracious, warm, technically perfect vocalist who made everything look easy. Who smiled at audiences and thanked them graciously and seemed completely comfortable with her extraordinary talent. That image wasn't just professional polish. It was protection. It was armor. It was the way she could exist and function in a world that had never felt fundamentally safe, not since she was a child. But this recording, this particular performance of this particular song, had somehow bypassed all that careful protection. It was too honest, too revealing, too much like the truth she'd been avoiding and running from for 20 years of professional success. It showed the cracks, the fear, the desperate need for validation underneath all the technical perfection. There was a soft knock on the bathroom door. "Ella?" It was Norman Granz, her manager and producer. One of the very few people who understood her well enough to know that walking out of a session wasn't about the music being technically flawed. "Can I come in, please?" She unlocked the door with trembling hands. Norman entered the small bathroom and closed the door gently behind him. He looked at Ella's tear-stained face, at the way she was holding herself like something might break, and he understood immediately that this went deeper than professional perfectionism. This was something else entirely. "What happened in there?" he asked gently, his voice carrying none of the impatience a producer might justifiably feel about a disrupted session. Ella tried to explain, tried to put into words the impossible gap between what everyone else heard and what she heard. Between the acclaim she received daily and the inadequacy she felt constantly. Between being called the greatest vocalist alive and feeling like an imposter who'd somehow managed to fool everyone for years and years. "I heard myself," she finally managed to say, her voice still thick with tears. "Really heard myself. Not just listening for wrong notes or technical problems, but really heard what I sound like. And I sounded so vulnerable, so exposed. Like everyone who hears this recording will know that I'm not what they think I am. Not confident. Not certain. Just scared." Norman was quiet. "Then, what if that's the point? What if being that honest is what makes you extraordinary?" Ella shook her head. "Everyone thinks I'm confident. They think I know I'm good. But I don't. I never have. And this recording shows that. It shows how uncertain I actually am. And that's why it's beautiful," Norman said. "Technical perfection is impressive. But vulnerability is what makes people connect. You've always been technically perfect, but this is the first time I've heard you let people see what's underneath." But Ella couldn't accept that. Not yet. The idea that her greatest weakness could somehow be strength was too foreign. She'd spent her career hiding uncertainty behind technical excellence. Deliberately revealing it was terrifying. The session resumed after 20 minutes. Ella returned, apologized, suggested they record another take. Norman, against his instincts, agreed. They recorded Misty again. Same arrangement. Everything identical except Ella's approach. This time she was careful. Controlled. Sang it perfectly, but with more distance. More polish and less emotional exposure. When they played it back, Ella nodded. That one's better. Norman didn't argue, but he also didn't erase the first take. Because he knew the first take, the one that made her run, was the better performance. Not technically, they were essentially identical, but emotionally. The first had truth. The second had excellence, but the truth was protected, hidden, kept safe. The album was released 6 months later. Norman used the first take. The vulnerable one. The honest one. The one Ella hadn't been able to listen to. And the response was extraordinary. Critics called it her most emotionally resonant performance. Listeners wrote letters saying how it moved them to tears. Musicians cited it as an example of how technical perfection and emotional authenticity could coexist. But Ella still couldn't listen to it. For years, if Misty played on the radio or in a restaurant, she'd leave the room. She never acknowledged why it affected people so deeply. Because acknowledging that would mean accepting that her vulnerability, her uncertainty, was what made the performance exceptional. The struggle between how Ella heard herself and how the world heard her continued throughout her career. Every recording session carried the same internal battle. The perfectionism that drove excellence also prevented her from appreciating it. The self-doubt that made her work harder also made her unable to enjoy the results. But something slowly shifted. Not suddenly, but gradually over years. Small moments accumulated. A live performance where she made a tiny mistake, corrected it with humor, and heard the audience laugh warmly. Affectionately. Like they appreciated her humanity as much as her perfection. Recording sessions where producers kept takes that felt emotionally right despite small technical imperfections. Conversations with younger singers who told her that her music meant something not because it was perfect but because it felt true. These moments created small cracks in the armor of perfectionism. Didn't shatter it, but let a little light through. Years later, in the 1970s, Ella finally listened to that recording of Misty, all the way through. Norman had died. She was going through old master tapes. And there it was. She sat alone and played it. Braced herself for the same overwhelming reaction. But something had changed. Not the recording. Her ability to hear it differently. She heard the vulnerability, yes. The exposure. But she also heard what everyone else had heard all along. The beauty. The artistry. The way technical perfection and emotional authenticity could support each other. She didn't cry this time. But she sat in silence for a long time after, understanding finally what Norman had tried to tell her. That the thing she'd feared was not a weakness to hide but a strength to embrace. This realization didn't erase all her self-doubt. Didn't suddenly make her confident, but it created a different relationship to her own voice. Instead of listening only for flaws, she could occasionally hear what the music actually communicated. The story of Ella Fitzgerald is usually told as unquestioned excellence. The greatest vocalist of her generation. Perfect pitch, perfect phrasing, perfect everything. And that's all true. But underneath was a woman who struggled to hear her own gift, who received love and acclaim but couldn't quite believe she deserved it, who sang with vulnerability that moved millions while trying desperately to protect herself from being seen as vulnerable. The recording session where she couldn't listen wasn't an anomaly. It was the visible moment when an internal struggle that had been ongoing for decades finally broke through the professional surface. The moment when the gap between self-perception and reality became too wide to ignore. And what makes this matter is not just that it happened to Ella. It's that it happens to many who achieve excellence. The imposter syndrome. The persistent doubt that you're not actually as good as people say. The fear that if people really knew you, they'd be disappointed. Ella's genius wasn't just in her voice. It was in her ability to keep creating beauty despite profound self-doubt. To keep performing despite never fully believing she was good enough. To give audiences something transcendent while privately questioning whether she had any right to be on that stage. The vulnerability she tried so hard to hide was exactly what made her performances resonate. People didn't just hear technical perfection. They heard a human being grappling with complex emotions and finding beauty in that complexity. They heard truth underneath the polish. When Ella Fitzgerald died in 1996, tributes focused on her extraordinary talent. The perfect pitch, the 3-octave range, the 6 decades of performing. the influence on generations. All accurate and deserved. But there was another legacy equally important. Someone who achieved greatness while battling persistent self-doubt. Who gave the world beauty while privately questioning her worth. Who proved you don't have to believe in yourself completely to create something others believe in absolutely. The recording of Misty remains one of her most celebrated performances. Listen today and you hear perfect execution combined with profound emotional honesty. A voice simultaneously confident and vulnerable. Strong and tender. Certain and uncertain. That's the paradox of Ella Fitzgerald. She was both things at once. The greatest vocalist of her generation and someone who struggled to appreciate her own gift. Technically perfect and emotionally exposed. Celebrated by millions and uncertain of her worth. The tape started playing at 2:17. 30 seconds later, Ella heard something in her own voice she couldn't bear to confront. But what she heard. The vulnerability, truth, and honest emotion she tried so hard to hide was exactly what made her artistry transcendent. She ran from that recording, but it remained, became part of her legacy. Proof that sometimes the things we fear most about ourselves are the very things that make us most human, most real, most worthy of the love we struggle to accept. Ella spent her career trying to be perfect, and she succeeded in ways few artists ever have. But her greatest gift wasn't the perfection. It was the humanity underneath it. The vulnerability she couldn't hide. The truth that came through despite her best efforts to protect it. That's the real story. Not just of a perfect voice, but of a human being who created beauty while battling doubt. Who gave the world something transcendent while privately struggling to believe she was good enough. Who proved excellence and uncertainty can coexist. And that understanding, that gradual acceptance of her own worth, might be the most important gift she gave. Not just the music, though that matters immensely, but the example. The proof that self-doubt doesn't disqualify you from greatness. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That being uncertain doesn't mean you're not extraordinary. The voice she couldn't hear became the voice the world couldn't forget. And in that gap between self-perception and reality lives one of the most profound truths about artistry, excellence, and what it means to be human.